I was standing at the kitchen window holding a chipped blue mug and waiting for the kettle to sing, when I saw something move near the woodpile. Not run, not crawl, just shift like a thought trying to become real. It had rained all night. One of those long, steady southern rains that doesn't thunder or flash, just settles in like it knows you have nowhere else to be. Everything outside was quiet, still, saturated. And then there it was. At first I thought it might be a squirrel, maybe even a wet possum, but no, too small, too narrow across the shoulders. And then I saw the spots. Barely the size of a loaf of bread soaked through with fur clinging like wet moss. A baby bobcat shivering under a lean-to of damp leaves and splintered bark. Not crying, not moving, just staring into the woodpile like it had once belonged there. I'm not proud of what I did next. I froze. Something in me whispered, "Leave it. Nature will handle it." But something louder, something in my chest refused. I opened the back door. The rain tapped gently on the porch tin like it was waiting too. I stepped barefoot onto the planks, not caring about the cold. I wrapped the little thing in an old flannel dish towel I used to keep for drying tomatoes. He didn't fight. He didn't even blink. Just let me lift him like a broken toy from a shelf. He was all bones, wet bones and paws too big for his body. I remember whispering, "All right, little one, you can fall apart now. You're not alone anymore." I didn't know then what I had brought into my life. But I did know this. I hadn't held anything that light or that alive in years. The last cat I'd held like that was named Muffin. A rescue too. Black and white with a crooked tail and a purr that could out-sing the radio. She passed 3 winters ago, right on the corner of the porch beside Winston's water bowl. Since then, I'd promised myself no more animals that leave paw prints on your heart. But promises like that aren't made to be kept. They're made when we're grieving, and grief always makes bargains it can't honor. People think rescue starts with a plan, that it happens inside cages or shelters with paperwork and collars. But sometimes rescue just begins with not walking away. That night, I didn't think of wildlife permits or feeding schedules or the fact that bobcats weren't meant to be pets. I didn't think of rules. I thought of warmth, of how empty the house had felt lately, even with the radio on. Even with Winston snoring in his old bed. Sometimes it's not about what you're saving. It's about what rises in you when something small and wild needs you more than you need your quiet. I laid him in a shoebox lined with my husband's old undershirt, the one I'd never been able to give away. I placed it near the fireplace, lit only by the soft flicker of coals that still remembered their purpose. I sat down in the rocking chair across from him. For an hour, I didn't move. I just watched the rise and fall of his tiny chest, the twitch of a damp ear, the almost invisible pulse in his temple. The rain didn't stop, but it changed. It became rhythm, background, breath. Young bobcats, especially orphaned cubs, rarely survive on their own in the wild if separated too early. They depend on maternal body heat and feeding for their first 8 to 12 weeks. Hypothermia and dehydration are the 2 most common causes of death. But in that moment, he didn't look like a statistic. He looked like a question, and my body answered it. Every instinct, every quiet, maternal pulse, still tucked beneath my ribs, answered yes. I named him Nico without thinking. It wasn't planned. It just fit the way he curled his tail, like he already belonged to something. Later, I'd learned that Nico means victory of the people. But that night, it just meant you're safe now. Winston watched the whole thing from the doorway. My golden retriever, 10 years older than this moment, half blind, slow in the hips. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply walked over, sniffed the box, and laid down beside it. Not touching, but close enough to catch the draft, close enough to say, "All right, one more." Winston hadn't shared his space with anything since David died. He'd grown into silence the way some dogs grow into their muzzles, slowly, then, all at once. I think he missed the sound of another heartbeat. That night, the 3 of us slept in the same room. No lullabies, no promises, just the sound of rain, and the tiniest purr I'd ever heard coming not from a kitten, but from the throat of something wild. We all have rooms in our homes we stop using after loss. Mine was the front room. David's chair is still there, still worn in all the right places. But that night I carried Nico in there while Winston limped behind us. I lit the lamp. And just like that, the room remembered how to be used. Have you ever taken in something small without knowing why? But it changed the way your whole house felt. Tell me in the comments. I'd love to read your story while holding a warm cup of tea. None of us thought Nico would make it through the night. But that old dog, he had other plans. He wasn't just watching, he was waiting. And what happened next was not something I taught him. It was something he already knew. Winston hadn't shared his bed in over 3 years. But on the second night, I found him curled around Nico like he'd been waiting his whole life for something small to protect. Winston's always been a quiet dog. He doesn't bark at the mailman. He doesn't chase after squirrels or howl at passing coyotes the way some dogs out here do. He mostly just listens, watches, waits. After David passed, he stopped sleeping in the living room. Instead, he'd curl up just inside my bedroom doorway, like a guardian still doing his job even when no one asked him to. I never had the heart to move him. When I brought Nico into the house that first rainy night, I didn't expect Winston to do much. I thought maybe he'd sniff then wander off like he did with most things lately. But he didn't. He lay down right beside the little box, close enough for warmth, not so close it would scare the cub. His old tail made a slow, thoughtful sweep across the floorboards, and he rested his chin on the ground. He didn't sleep that night. He watched. At 6 a.m., when I finally nodded off in the chair, it was Winston's paw, tapping gently at my knee, that woke me. Nico had rolled onto his side. His chest barely moved, but it moved. Winston's nose was nearly touching him, breath steady, eyes soft. I remember whispering, "You did good, boy." And I could have sworn his tail wagged just once in response, more felt than seen. That's when I realized Winston had taken on the job before I even asked. He saw something in Nico I didn't know how to name yet. Not just fragility, but belonging. It's not unheard of. Older dogs, especially breeds like retrievers, are known to adopt protective behaviors toward younger animals, even those from other species. Animal behaviorists say it might stem from scent triggers or from a dog's intrinsic empathy. A trait we're still trying to fully understand. What we call instinct might just be love without words. I didn't read that in a book, though. I saw it every time Winston curled a little tighter around that box, ears twitching whenever Nico stirred. By day 3, Nico started wobbling out of the box on unsteady legs. I'd set up an old quilt by the hearth, thinking he might like the warmth. He never used it. Instead, he'd crawl clumsy as a newborn fawn, straight toward Winston's paws. Once he collapsed right onto Winston's front leg and started snoring before he even settled. Winston didn't move, didn't flinch, just let him be. It reminded me of watching David with our granddaughter when she was a baby. She'd crawl right up to him and fall asleep across his chest, and he wouldn't move for hours, even if his back ached, even if the game was on. It's the kind of stillness that only comes from choosing someone else's comfort over your own. Sometimes the deepest bonds don't begin with joy. They begin with grief. I don't know what Winston remembers. I don't pretend to know how dogs think. But I know that something in Nico woke up something in him. Maybe it was the sound of tiny claws tapping the floor again. Maybe it was the weight of a smaller body curled against his side. Or maybe it was just the simple, quiet truth he was needed again. And when we are needed, we live a little longer, even if we don't say it out loud. One afternoon, I stepped outside to hang laundry and came back in to find them both asleep. Winston sprawled across the rug like a patch of golden moss, and Nico tucked into the crook behind his shoulder blade like a fallen leaf. The fire had gone out, the wind was picking up, but the room felt warmer than it had all winter. That's the thing about animals, they don't explain their healing. They just show up, stay close, and do the work quietly. A bobcat and a dog don't belong together, at least not according to most wildlife manuals. But here's the thing, no manual can account for what happens when instincts are softened by familiarity. When the wild doesn't feel like danger, but like family. We think of animal rescue as a one-way act. A human saves a creature, and that's the story. But what if we've got it backwards? What if the tiny paws, the old snout, the curled bodies by the fire, what if they're the ones rescuing us from loneliness, from forgetting how to care, from forgetting how to sit still and just breathe beside another living thing? One evening, I caught myself humming a song I hadn't sung in years. Just a lullaby I used to sing to my daughter when she was little. Nico was asleep in Winston's arms and I was washing dishes by the window. I didn't even realize the words had come out. It's strange what returns to you when love sneaks back into the room. If you've ever watched an animal become more than just a pet, if they became a protector, a parent, or something, you can't explain. Leave their name in the comments. I read them every night. They were becoming something more than just housemates, more than rescuer and rescued. And the more Nico leaned in, the more Winston began to shine again. But just as one life begins to blossom, you start to feel the weight of how fragile it all still is. And that's what I felt next. The quiet fear of learning to breathe again, and not knowing how long it would last. You don't notice the moment a creature starts choosing life again. You just wake up one morning and they're no longer curled in fear. They're standing tiny chest forward, ready to explore the world that once nearly broke them. Nico's recovery didn't happen in a burst. It came like spring in the Ozarks, quiet, almost suspiciously slow. One morning I set his bottle down on the quilt like always. But instead of waiting for me to lift it to his mouth, he took one uncertain step toward it. And I mean just one. Wobbly, quick. But it was the kind of step you remember. Because it wasn't about hunger, it was about choice. Later that day I found him perched barely upright on Winston's tail. Winston, as always, didn't budge. The two of them sat there staring out the back window like old friends who'd forgotten the need for words. It struck me standing there, dish towel in hand. This was the first time I wasn't scared he wouldn't make it. It didn't mean he was better, but he was becoming. In wildlife rescue, there's a name for this stage. It's called the transition window, when an animal shifts from dependent to curious, from surviving to imprinting. Their body begins to regulate on its own temperature, digestion, even breathing. It's also when caregivers are warned not to get too attached, to prepare for distance. But no one tells you how to do that while your old dog is letting a bobcat nap in the crook of his belly every night. No one tells you how to unthread love from caution. Sometimes I'd sit on the floor beside them after dinner. I'd close my eyes, just listening to the hush of their breathing, the occasional snore, the little sounds of peace that I'd forgotten were still possible in this house. And I'd think, this is what healing sounds like. Not a choir, not a sermon, just the hush of companionship in a room that used to echo too much. Nico started following me into the kitchen. At first he'd trip over his paws, slid across the floor like butter on a hot skillet. But every morning he grew more stable. He learned where the sun hit the tile around 10 a.m. He'd curl into that pool of gold and blink slowly, letting warmth do what medicine never could. Feeding him was still a process. We were on a mix of kitten formula and soft-cooked turkey. He'd only eat it from my hand, warmed just so. My kitchen became part feeding station, part field clinic. Winston would lie behind me as I worked. He didn't hover, just made sure someone had our backs. Caring for Nico reminded me of caring for my mother during her final months. The small tasks, the quiet rituals, how time slows down and magnifies the way you fold a blanket. The sound of water poured into a bowl, the patience of waiting for someone to be ready. You stop living by the clock. You start living by the heartbeat. We talk about wild animals as if they're defined by what they could become. Fierce, dangerous, untamable. But watching Nico inch his way across the floor just to rest his paw on Winston's leg, I didn't see a wildcat. I saw a soul learning how to trust the world again. And isn't that all of us at some point trying to find something soft enough to rest in, something steady enough to follow, something warm enough to call home, even if it doesn't last forever? There was one afternoon quiet golden when Nico chased a dust mote through the living room. His tail flicked in perfect arcs. Winston lifted his head just enough to watch. I reached for my camera, but I didn't press the button. Some moments aren't meant to be captured. They're meant to be lived and let go. That's the thing about wild animal rescue. The goal is not to keep, it's to prepare them to leave. but I wasn't ready to think about that yet. Not while Nico still slept with his nose tucked beneath Winston's chin. I remember one night I couldn't sleep. Got up around 2 a.m., made a cup of peppermint tea, sat at the window. It had rained again. The wind smelled like pine needles and damp earth. I glanced down and there they were. Nico and Winston curled so tightly together you couldn't see where one ended and the other began. I whispered into the dark, "You boys just keep teaching me how to breathe again, all right." And somewhere deep in the hush of the house, I could swear it answered back. Has an animal ever helped you return to yourself quietly, gently, without words? Leave their name below. Let's keep their memory alive together. Nico was stronger now, braver. But with every leap, every playful pounce, every wild flick of his growing tail, I started to feel it, that quiet ache that comes when you realize they're not meant to stay. And one morning it happened. He disappeared. Just for a moment. But it was enough to change everything. He disappeared for 5 minutes. That's all it took for my heart to forget how to beat. When I found him again, perched on Winston's back, tiny claws tangled in that old dog's fur, I realized something Nico wasn't just surviving anymore. He was becoming wild again. It started one morning with a noise. A soft scrape, a bump. The kind that makes you hold your breath before you move. The box by the fire was empty. The blanket had slipped halfway to the floor, and for one long second I thought, he's gone. Then I saw the movement, a flash of tawny fur near Winston's bed. And there he was, balanced like a tightrope walker on the ridge of Winston's shoulder, ears-high eyes, bright tail twitching like it was listening to something only he could hear. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the light spilling through the curtain. And I remember thinking, that's the call of the forest right there, in his eyes. Later that day, I tried to move him back to his box, but he wriggled free. Not to run away, just to explore. He pawed at the floorboards, sniffed the rug, then darted under the couch with the quickness of a thought. When he came out again, he carried one of Winston's tennis balls in his mouth. It was half his size. He tripped, growled at it, then pounced again. Winston lifted his head, sighed, and went back to sleep. It was the first time I laughed out loud in months. Not a polite smile, not that small exhale you give when something's sweet. A real laugh. The kind that rolls up from the ribs and reminds you that joy isn't gone. It was just waiting for a reason to show up. In wildlife rescue, they say young bobcats begin to test their strength around 4 weeks. Their instincts bloom before their muscles are ready. Little bodies driven by the memory of generations that learned how to climb, stalk, and survive. It's not learned. It's remembered. A kind of wisdom written into their bones. Watching Nico was like watching an ancient story wake up inside something so small it could still fit in my hands. He didn't need lessons. He just needed space. And that's when the truth hit me. I had built him a home, but I couldn't be his forever. Every time he leapt, I felt both pride and fear. Because every small success carried a shadow behind it, one step closer to leaving. Still, I couldn't stop him. You don't cage something meant to run. You just stand close enough to catch them if they fall. One afternoon, I opened the back door to sweep the porch. Winston was dozing nearby, and Nico trotted right past him, straight out into the sunlight. He stopped on the threshold, paused, testing the air as if asking the earth for permission. Then, with a tiny grunt, he leapt off the step and landed in a pile of dry leaves. For the first time, I saw him under the open sky. His fur caught the light. His spots looked sharper. He crouched, low tail flicking eyes wide with the thrill of freedom. I wanted to call him back, but I didn't. I just watched hand on the doorframe, heart caught somewhere between awe and ache. It's a strange thing to love something that's meant to leave you. You start measuring time not in hours, but in shared heartbeats. Rescue isn't about possession, it's about participation. You enter a creature's story for a brief, holy moment. You help them heal, you walk beside them, and then you let them find their own ending. Humans have a way of mistaking care for control. But animals, especially wild ones like bobcats, remind us love doesn't always look like keeping. Sometimes it looks like watching them walk away and trusting that you've given them enough to survive out there. That evening, Winston and I sat by the open window. The air smelled like pine and rain-soaked dirt. Nico was curled in his usual spot, half on Winston's paw, half on my faded quilt. The sunset pressed through the glass, painting them both in amber. Winston's old fur shimmered like dried wheat. Nico's eyes glowed the color of honey. It felt sacred, like watching two seasons overlap. Youth and age, wild and gentle, rest and renewal. There was no sound but breathing. No movement but the slow rise and fall of their chests. If you've ever watched peace settle into a room, you know what I mean. It's not loud. It's not showy. It's earned. That night reminded me of a story David once told me. He said that when he was a boy, his father found a hawk tangled in fishing wire. They kept it for 2 days, just long enough to cut it loose, feed it, and let it rest. Then, one morning, the hawk was gone. The boy was heartbroken, but his father said, "If it comes back, it'll come by choice, not by chain." I never forgot that. Looking at Nico, I finally understood what he meant. Maybe everything we love, people, animals, memories, is borrowed for a while. Our job is to care for them with both hands open. As the nights got colder, Nico started finding new ways to climb chairs. Windowsills, Winston's back. He loved height, the view, the small power of seeing more than before. I used to think he was just restless, but maybe he was learning perspective the way we all do after loss. You climb a little higher, not to escape, but to understand where you've been. One evening he perched on the back of the couch, eyes fixed on the dark beyond the glass. Winston slept below him, steady and warm, and I whispered, "One day you'll go out there, won't you?" He blinked slowly, as if to say yes, but not tonight. Have you ever had to let go of something you loved, an animal, a place, a season, and trusted that it would find its way? Tell me what helped you do it. Someone reading might need your story tonight. Nico kept climbing into sunlight, into strength, into everything that waited beyond my arms. And every night without fail, he'd curl back beside Winston before sleep. That was their promise, their ritual. No matter how far he wandered by day, he always came home at dusk. But even rituals change. And soon the nights would bring their own kind of test. Because that tiny wild heart was about to choose a place to rest, and it wouldn't be the box by the fire anymore. A quiet, tender chapter of comfort memory and the healing rhythm of shared rest between an old dog and a growing bobcat. At first it was the armpit, then the space under Winston's ear. Then finally the crook of his chest where the rhythm was slow and steady. That's where Nico decided to sleep. And once he chose it, nothing, not even me, could move him. Sleep is sacred in this house. Not because it's quiet, not because it's rare, but because it's earned. For a long time after David passed, I didn't sleep through the night. I'd toss and turn, drifting in and out of shallow dreams that ended in silence. Even Winston had trouble. He used to pace the hallway, nails clicking against the floor like a metronome of grief. But then came Nico, and suddenly sleep had a shape again. A sound, a story. The first night he curled into Winston's chest, I was afraid. I'd read all the warnings. Wild animals shouldn't be kept close, don't encourage bonding that might not last. Keep boundaries for rewilding. And yet, what boundary do you draw when a tiny spotted body finds the one heartbeat in the house steady enough to fall asleep to? He didn't just fall asleep. He surrendered. That kind of trust doesn't come from training. It comes from the soul. Winston didn't stir. He just adjusted like he'd been waiting for this wait all along. In the wild, young bobcats sleep in nests built by their mothers, dens made from leaves and soft earth lined with fur. What they seek most in sleep isn't space. It's warmth, familiarity, the drum of another life beating near theirs. What Nico found in Winston wasn't just comfort, it was a body that felt like safety. And that, more than any formula or medicine, is what keeps an animal alive. I started leaving the lamp off at night, letting the room fill with shadows and quiet, with just the glow of the fireplace coals and the sound of two hearts breathing in sync. Sometimes I'd wake at midnight and glance over Nico curled like a comet tail flicked across Winston's paw ears, twitching softly in dream. Winston, for his part, looked 10 years younger when he slept with Nico. Less stiff, less gray. Some nights I imagined he thought Nico was his, and in some ways maybe he was. There's something about watching two creatures sleep together that softens the world a bit. No politics, no grief, no questions, just presence. You see it and you think, maybe it's all going to be okay after all, even if you don't know how. That's what Nico gave back to this house. Not answers, not miracles, just the gentle nightly reminder that closeness is its own kind of healing. One night I thought I'd try moving Nico to a little cot I'd made for him in the corner, just to see if he'd rest alone. He went stiff in my hands. Not scared, not angry, just unwilling. When I set him down, he turned, climbed off, walked back to Winston and planted himself chin on the old dog's ribcage, eyes fluttering closed before he even settled. I didn't try again. Who was I to tell a creature where home was? So often we think rescue is a straight line. Find, feed, heal, release. But sometimes the real rescue isn't in what we do for animals, it's in how we let them do for each other. Watching Nico and Winston, I realized I wasn't the center of this story. I was the shelter, the quiet place, but the bond between them, that was the medicine. A baby bobcat and an old retriever taught each other how to rest again, how to let go of what hurt and trust that something good might be waiting tomorrow. The last time Muffin, my old cat, ever slept on my chest was the night before she died. She curled up just under my collarbone and purred so deeply I thought it might echo forever. I didn't move until sunrise. That was nearly 3 years ago, and here I was again, wrapped in warmth, wrapped in memory, watching a new life settle into the soft place grief had hollowed out. One morning I opened the curtains before sunrise. The sky was still dark, just touched with frost. Nico stirred, then climbed onto Winston's back, settling like a crown. Winston, still half asleep, adjusted his weight and exhaled one long, slow breath that made the room feel steady. It was the kind of moment you don't capture, you don't narrate, you just let it be. Because some scenes were written long before we arrived. Our job is just to witness them gently. Do you remember the last time you felt completely safe with someone or something? If it's a memory you're willing to share, I'd be honored to read it. Let's fill this space with softness tonight. The nights held us for a little while longer. Winston, Nico, me. 3 creatures from different worlds breathing in the same rhythm. But even I could feel it shifting just a little. The light outside was changing. The wind carried the scent of pine. And Nico. He started looking toward the trees again. Because wild hearts, no matter how gently held, eventually remember where they come from. And one morning, I would have to let the forest in. The day Nico chased a grasshopper into the tree line, something in me sank. Not because he ran too far, but because for the first time he didn't look back. You know the feeling. You've walked a child to the school gates, stood at the edge of a train platform, or waved from a porch as someone pulled out of the driveway. That ache in your chest, the kind that's equal parts pride and pain. It's the ache of knowing you're no longer the center of their world. And you shouldn't be. That's what it felt like watching Nico cross the backyard alone. He moved like he belonged out there. Tail low, ears high, body relaxed. Not with the skittish steps of a house kitten, but the fluid motion of something that remembered what it once was a bobcat, quiet and quick and deeply aware of the wind. He was following a grasshopper of all things. It had landed on the stone path near the garden and he froze. Then came the slow crouch, the ripple of muscle under spotted fur. Then the pounce, clumsy, still learning. He missed. Twice. But he kept trying. By the time I noticed how far he'd gone, he was near the tree line. Nose to the moss, tail flicking like a metronome. I stepped onto the porch and called him softly. He didn't flinch. Didn't even pause. And in that moment, I understood he didn't need my voice to feel safe anymore. As bobcats grow, their wild instincts sharpen. Around 6 to 8 weeks, their senses expand, smell, sound tracking, spatial memory. In the wild, this is when they start trailing their mother on short hunts, testing their claws in coordination. For rescued cubs, this moment is delicate. It's when the shelter they've known becomes both sanctuary and cage. If you love them too tightly, you stunt their return. If you release too soon, you risk their life. It's a narrow bridge, and walking it with Nico took everything I had. I'd known from the start that Nico wasn't mine to keep. Still, knowing something and feeling it are different beasts entirely. I caught myself watching him too long through the kitchen window, worrying when he stayed out past dusk, holding my breath every time a hawk circled overhead. That night, I set a dish of warm milk on the porch, not because he needed it, but because I did. And just before midnight, he returned, silent as fog, stepping through the moonlight like a memory. He didn't touch the milk, just curled up beside Winston and went to sleep. The next day, I made a choice. I opened the gate to the woods. It wasn't locked, hasn't been in years, but I opened it wide, moved the old rake, cleared the fallen branch. I stood back and said quietly, "When you're ready." Winston sat beside me. His gaze followed Nico like he'd already let go, as if he understood something I didn't yet. That day, Nico didn't leave, but he stared at the gate longer than usual. We think love means holding on, but sometimes the deeper kind of love, the braver kind, is knowing when to step aside. Letting the forest in doesn't mean giving up. It means trusting that what you've built is strong enough to remain even if the walls fall away. Nico would never be mine, not in the way a dog or a cat lives under your name. But he would always carry this time, this porch, this dog, this quiet corner of the Ozarks. Sometimes home isn't where you stay, it's where you become. That week I started walking the edge of the woods each evening, not to find him, just to be near. I'd run my fingers across the tall grass, listen for the rustle of paws. Some nights he'd appear like a whisper, other nights not at all, but I always left the gate open. And I always left a trail of his favorite dried turkey snacks. Not as bait, as breadcrumbs. A way to say, you don't owe me your return, but I'll always make it easy for you to come back. David used to do that for me when we were first married. He worked long shifts at the mill and got home after dark. Every now and then, when I had a hard day, I wouldn't greet him at the door. Instead of knocking or calling, he'd leave a note by the kettle, teas on. "I'm in the den. Come when you're ready." I never realized until now. That's what trust looks like, not forcing closeness, just leaving room for it. By late October, the trees began to burn gold and copper. The mornings came colder, breath visible in the air. Nico's coat thickened, his paws widened. He looked more wild with every sunrise. Still, every few days I'd find his prints in the garden bed, tiny indentations near the marigolds, a soft reminder he hadn't forgotten. And neither had I. Have you ever had to open a gate, literal or not, for someone you love? A child, a pet, a parent, a friend? If you've been there, your story might help someone who's standing at their own gate tonight. Share it below. And then one morning the gate stayed untouched. No paw prints, no pressed grass, no scratch at the door. Winston waited at the porch till dark. I did too. And when Nico didn't come home that night, I realized we were entering a new kind of quiet. Not the one born from loss, but the one that comes right before return. The morning Nico didn't return, Winston didn't move from the porch. He waited until the shadows touched his paws, and then he laid his head down like he already knew something I didn't. There are different kinds of silence. Some feel soft, like morning fog, drifting between the trees. Others feel like a door quietly closing. That day, the silence felt different, not because it was louder, but because it was empty. For the first time in weeks, Nico didn't come home. Not at dawn, not at dusk, not even when I shook his little tin of turkey treats the way I always had. Click, click, pause. Nothing. The yard was still, the gate still open, the dish untouched. I spent the morning walking the tree line. No calls, no flashlight, just slow steps, listening. Winston walked beside me for a while, then sat down beneath the old sycamore. Didn't whine, didn't look worried, just waited. I kept glancing back at him, thinking maybe he'd tell me something. Maybe dogs do know. Maybe they just accept change better than we do. Back at the porch, I wrote Nico's name in my journal, just his name and the date. No periods, no summary, just space. Loss doesn't always come with sound. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a bowl that stays full, a blanket that stays folded, a patch of grass that's no longer flattened in the morning dew. But you learn after enough years that grief doesn't just ask, "What did I lose?" It quietly wonders, "What do I still carry?" And somehow, that's where the gentleness lives. It's easy to think that what we love disappears when it's no longer visible. But maybe love isn't measured by presence. Maybe it's measured by imprint. The way a wild animal leaves behind a trail of bent grass. The way a scent lingers in the air long after a paw has left the porch. The way a golden retriever still looks toward the woods even if no one's coming out. Maybe what stays is quieter than we expect. And maybe that's the point. On the third night, Winston stopped sleeping in his usual spot. Instead, he curled up by the back door facing outward. I think he knew Nico was still out there. Not lost, not gone. Just living the story he was meant to live. There's a kind of wisdom that comes with age, and Winston wore it like a blanket. No panic, no pleading, just trust. And I tried to follow his lead. I started writing to Nico in my diary. Just little notes. A sentence here, a memory there. You once dragged a pine cone into the kitchen like it was treasure. Winston barked at a squirrel. Today your job, remember. Still keeping your blanket clean, just in case. I didn't write to call him back. I wrote to remember that he had been here, that he had mattered, that this house had felt more alive because of a wild thing who stayed long enough to teach us how to soften again. Many bobcat cubs, even when hand-raised, return to the wild once they feel strong enough. It's a natural phase of development marked not by rebellion, but by readiness. They don't mean to break your heart. They're just following the blueprint written in their bones. And when they go, if you've done it right, they go without needing to look back. That's the strange reward of rescue. They leave you so well-loved. They don't have to stay. I remember years ago when our daughter left for college. David stood at the sink for a long time after her car pulled away. He didn't cry. He just said, "You raised them to go." And still it feels like losing something. That's what it was. With Nico. The same ache, the same hope tucked inside the goodbye. The nights that followed were quiet. No purring, no thuds of tiny paws chasing shadows, but Winston still slept soundly, and the gate stayed open. One evening I noticed a feather in the bowl Nico used to drink from. Not wind-blown, placed. I smiled, and I said out loud to the trees, "Okay, little one, see you." Have you ever had to say a quiet goodbye, one without words, without certainty, but full of love? If that moment has stayed with you, share it below. There's always someone who needs to hear they're not alone. Nico didn't return the way I expected. But then again, the best things rarely do. Somewhere out there, a young bobcat sleeps beneath the stars, strong, sure, and free. And in this house, an old dog still rests by the door, and I still leave the lamp on. Just in case. Because even when they leave, some part of them always stays. There are some goodbyes you never say out loud. Not because you're holding on, but because what was shared doesn't really leave. Some love just settles into the walls, into the routines, into the rhythm of how a home breathes when the world is quiet. And that's how Nico stayed. I used to think healing meant things going back to how they were. That a rescued animal would get strong, come home every night, curl up beside the old dog, and purr like clockwork. That comfort was consistency. But life, especially out here in the woods, it doesn't run on clocks. It runs on seasons, on instinct, on soft departures and unexpected returns. And it turns out, healing isn't about keeping, it's about what's left behind. A week after Nico disappeared into the trees, I found Winston sniffing around the edge of the garden. He paused, then laid down beside a small patch of wild daisies. There nestled among the petals was a tuft of fur, not shed, not torn. Placed. It wasn't much. Just a soft-spotted bit of Nico's coat. But it felt like permission, a message. Not I'm gone, but I'm okay. When David passed, I remember someone telling me, you won't know what to do with your hands for a while, but eventually they'll find their purpose again. And it was true. For months they fidgeted, reached for things that weren't there. But then they learned how to hold Winston's leash again, how to braid twine around the tomato stakes, how to carry a bobcat kitten without trembling. Now they know how to leave the gate open without hurting, how to rest, how to let peace come through the trees instead of the door. When we talk about animal rescue, we often picture it as one-sided. The person helps the animal gets better. The end. But the truth is, every time we rescue, we're rescued right back. Nico gave me something I hadn't known I was missing. Not just the sound of small paws on the floor or the soft tug of care routines, but purpose, presence, and the reminder that life is always moving even when it feels still. He showed Winston how to nurture again. He reminded me how to trust change. He brought a piece of the wild into our home and left a kind of stillness that's never really quiet, just gentle. Concrete example, symbolic action. This fall I planted something new in the corner of the yard. A patch of native wildflowers and low brush, perfect cover for little paws. I didn't do it to lure Nico back. I did it to honor where he came from, to make a place where the wild felt welcome. Sometimes I sit nearby with a mug of tea, Winston resting at my feet. We don't look for him, but we listen. And on a good day, we hear the leaves shift ever so slightly. We feel the eyes watching from just beyond the tree line, and that's enough. Because sometimes love doesn't come running, it just returns in its own way. Wild animals like bobcats follow the rhythm of nature. They seek companionship when they're small, safety when they're healing, and solitude when they're ready. That cycle isn't a failure of the bond. It's a fulfillment of it. To love something wild is to love it for who it is, not who we want it to stay. And in doing so, we become part of the forest too. Not just observers, but quiet participants. I still leave the lamp on some nights, not because I expect him to return, but because it comforts me to have a light near the door. It says you were here once, and if you come back even for a moment, this place remembers you, just like I remember the way you curled into Winston's side, the way your paws tucked under as you breathed deep, the way you never needed a cage to stay close, just a feeling of safety. That's what this house is now, a place where wild things rested and left behind their peace. Maybe you've had a Nico in your life. Someone or something you held for a season who changed you without ever asking to. Maybe you're holding the gate open right now for someone you love. Or maybe, like me, you're learning to trust that what's meant to come back will. In its own time, in its own way. So pause for a moment. Breathe. Ask yourself gently, what have I rescued that somehow rescued me too? Maybe it was a dog, a cat, a baby bobcat. Maybe it was a moment, a memory, a part of yourself you thought you'd lost. Whatever it was, it mattered. It still does. And you're allowed to rest in that. If this story stirred something in you, I hope you'll stay a little longer with us here. Click like if Nico's journey felt familiar to your heart. Subscribe if you'd like to walk gently with us through more stories like his of rescue, release, and quiet companionship. And if you feel called to help other wild animals like Nico, those who are injured, orphaned, or simply lost, you can leave a super thanks or donate directly to support wildlife rescue efforts. Every small act matters, just like every small creature. Because healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it purrs, and sometimes it curls up quietly beside an old dog and teaches the whole world how to breathe again. Thank you for being here. We'll keep the porch light on for you too.